Well, Marc Ostwald is Chief Economist and Global Strategist with ADM Investor Services International. Marc, welcome. Global supply chains are under enormous pressure, that's clear. We're seeing a shortage of materials, we know about that. Prices on the rise, energy crunches we've been reporting on in this programme. How did we get here? Is it just about the pandemic?
A lot of it's about the pandemic. I think, when we're talking about supply shortages, the things that we have most supply shortages of is people. And it's about the free movement of people. Because of the pandemic, eminently, there's been a lot of people you could normally draw on aren't available because they're either in areas where there are restrictions, and in the UK's case, obviously, because there are additional restrictions due to Brexit. So it's as much about people as it is about the goods which aren't being moved because the people aren't available to move them.
Give us a bit of context. If you're as old as you or me, is this like the 70s?
No, it's slightly different to the 70s because this is largely about the pandemic impact on what we have established as globalized supply chains, which rely on just-in-time production. And we were basically learning some very hard lessons about how fragile those supply chains actually are. And that's be that power or actually goods or raw materials. These are all basically dependent on everything running smoothly. And the moment that you've got something like the pandemic with its massive disruptions, suddenly it's effectively like throwing a pack of cards up in the air and you don't know which way they're going to land.
Are these just temporary headwinds that perhaps will blow themselves out given time? Or are we in a seemingly never-ending crisis, and should we, therefore, be very worried?
We're not in a never-ending crisis, but they're not these things which can be resolved very easily, very quickly. One of the things which eminently has to happen is we need that freedom of movement of people so that people can fill those labour shortages on a demand basis, as it was previously. But some of the other supply disruptions, we're transitioning to a greener form of energy production, and that in itself is basically a major, major challenge. And people who think that we can dump hydrocarbons, need to think again. There are a lot of very complex supply chains involved, and that needs to basically be managed much more carefully than the absolutist, let's get rid of all this hydrocarbon now, because it can't be done. Otherwise, we will have nasty consequences, above all in terms of, the biggest problem at the moment is you've got inflation in food, energy, and partially in goods, but I think that will disappear with time, and in housing. Those are all non-discretionary areas, and that's really where the biggest problem is, because at some stage, something's going to have to give on wages if this is going to last very long.
Central banks have been chucking enormous amounts of cheap money at the global economy for seemingly years, well, certainly the past decade or so, because they were worried about a repeat of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Despite all of that cash, we still haven't really seen a full recovery. Why is that? Did the economists get all that wrong?
Well, one thing that central banks, well, there's two things. One, central banks have basically encouraged a lot of asset price inflation when they were actually trying to create goods and services inflation, which were being negated the whole time by technology. Secondly, in the current situation, central banks can't create movement of people. Central banks can't create jobs. Central banks can't resolve power supply crises, or indeed raw materials supplies. And they also can't make up for the fact that we've been underinvesting in all our grids around the world, because this problem stretches all the way from China through Europe into North America and into South America. There's all things which they're powerless to influence. And it basically tells us that politicians have used the central bank monetary largesse to basically sit on their hands and not do nasty reforms or uncomfortable reforms, things which will be resisted, but things which need to be done. And that's really the crux point where we are. We're showing up the limits of what central banks can do, and the fact that politicians actually need to put their hands in the fire, forget about the electoral cycle, and actually address some of the infrastructure problems that they've got in most of these countries.
So what is that magic wand? What is the one thing they should roll up their sleeves and do?
How about cooperation? Because the one thing that we've seen through the pandemic and with all the tensions that are rising between the West and China and Russia is that there's much less cooperation. And without that cooperation and with people objecting to helping each other, we're not actually going to get through this because we all need each other in all of this. And you know, that sort of confrontational aspect is actually only making the situation worse.
Marc Ostwald in London, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.